without further ado, I'm Mitch Stein. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Pond. We do a ton of educational content like this, live, interactive, and you can also use Pond for anything you need to buy for your nonprofit. If you need new software, technology, consulting services, outsourced bookkeeping, you name it, we've got about 100 categories with hundreds of vendors. And we help you through that entire search process and matching with the right folks. So be sure to check that out and check out our upcoming sessions as well. Today, we have a really special guest that I've gotten to know over the past 2 years, Nicholas Kristock, who just has an amazing story. I will obviously want him to share it and won't spoil it, but he also has this awesome video that went pretty viral, his own hero talk about his journey founding Fleece and Thank You and his nonprofit entrepreneurial journey. So I'm sure we'll get into more of that today, but I'd love to start off before we get into the overhead topic. I think it'd be helpful for folks to learn more about your story, Nicholas. So I'd love for you to just intro yourself, kind of let us know what you're up to today. And if you wouldn't mind sharing a couple layers of your identity that are most important to you.
For sure. Yeah. Peel off the onion a little bit here at the start. I love it. Yeah. Thanks, Mitch. Thanks to everyone for tuning in live, or if you're consuming this, post live. I think it takes someone who cares a lot about the space to dive into this topic. And I'm so appreciative of the webinar series you're putting on this month about disruption. And this is a topic that I'm really passionate about today. So super pumped to dive in. Quick story on me. I've been in the nonprofit space since 2010 when I started my first nonprofit ever just to fund local missions trips. It was just a friend that wanted to go to Haiti and did a bunch of can drives and got her ticket to Haiti. And that kind of sparked the initial inspiration. I was a soccer hockey guy in the Midwest growing up, and soccer took me overseas for a couple of seasons to play in Australia. I had a ton of free time and dove into the philanthropic space, was working with Make-A-Wish Australia, helped founding Orange Sky Australia, the world's first mobile laundry service for the homeless, living homeless myself in Australia as part of a case study there, and just fell in love with the space. Moved back to Michigan in 2015, got an opportune text message from my twin sister who was working in pediatric healthcare asking if I could make a blanket for a kid in the hospital. I started asking a ton of questions, and I think I've got to where I am in life because I'm aggressively curious, for better or for worse, and started Fleece and Thank You, a journey to provide every child in the state of Michigan with a colorful, comfortable fleece blanket, each one with a video message of support from the person that made it. Fleece and Thank You is now grown. We serve every single children's hospital and unit in the state of Michigan and have delivered comfort to all 50 states, getting orders from around the country every single day. Really, really amazing initiative. And out of Fleece and Thank You, that video software made that into a company called KindCatch that now other great nonprofits get to help leverage as far as how they collect and personalize content to their audience. And so that's the quick version, Mitch.
Awesome. And thank you for, first of all the folks you're helping, and just all the work that I know went into getting this off the ground and at the scale it is today. So kudos to you. And as another startup founder, I know that takes a lot of perseverance and ongoing effort. So we're really grateful for you. I'd love, before we get into some of your talk that you gave, like, just so people can understand, you gave the quick version, but where did you think this started for you? Like, when you were a kid, did you always think like, oh, I want to be a nonprofit leader? Or like, when did that change where you decided like this was your life's calling?
There were two responses in my life, responses to things that were happening that lit the fire. And I really credit these two specifically. One was sitting in a college apartment. Friend Kristen walks in. Guys, get off your butts. I need you to help me go collect cans. What are we collecting cans for? Flight ticket to Haiti, $1,000, going to serve on a mission. Ended up collecting cans for 5 weeks, getting her that flight ticket. That was spark one. Spark two, really good friend in college, had gone through an osteosarcoma journey. And I could see from that treatment journey that it was really hard to understand exactly what happened from the psychosocial side in that treatment room and beyond, and that lack of connection and all the things that come with a cancer journey. And so I dove into volunteering with kids in the hospital just to try to understand my friend better. And those two responses to things happening in my life and asking questions and pursuing the answers to those questions really started it all.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. And you gave a lot of this background in your hero talk, which we will share the link to. I highly recommend people tune in. It was called How to Build a Business to Solve a Problem. It might sound a bit like an obvious title, but you really explained it well in the session. I would just advocate that people bring a couple tissues because it is very moving, and Nick is an amazing public speaker. But I'd love to hear like some of the most surprising reactions you had to that session. And you walked through these 10 like key lessons on those critical first steps of starting something new. What were like some of the most surprising pieces of feedback you heard afterwards?
Yeah, a lot of feedback in general on that talk. I think for a lot of people, they appreciated that it broke down the first 10 steps that they could do. And I think almost all of those steps, if I remember correctly, you don't need $1 to do. So you can take the first 10 steps to start a business, solve a problem, and not spend $1, just spend and invest your time. And then the second one being how intensely I promote living the problem that you're trying to solve. I just am so sold out to that fact that you can go and live a problem, stare in the face and feel its pain, that when the obstacles come, and as we both know, they're undoubtedly going to come, you have that staying power to say, maybe I'm not supposed to be doing this, right? Like maybe I'll just let someone else take care of this. Maybe I'll let someone else solve this problem. It's just not going to be a thought if you've gone and lived that problem. So those are probably the two pieces of it, feedback I get of, hey, this is great. You broke it down without spending $1 to build a business at the start, and then living the problem, how intensely I promote that.
Sorry about that. The most striking thing to me was that you never mentioned the word nonprofit in the entire talk. And you use these terms like building a business, solving problems. I assume that was intentional. Do you mind sharing a bit about why you choose that specific language?
Yeah, so appreciate this question, Mitch. It's a perfect segue into the broader topic we're going to tackle today of there's a dismantling that needs to start to happen between the for-profit and nonprofit world. And even if we can get away at someday of the terms, right, and the disillusions that they create. And so I don't even mention the word nonprofit in that talk, because businesses should solve problems. And we all know the world has enough problems to be solved. We need great minds to apply themselves to solve them, whether it's in a for-profit LLC, C Corp capacity or a 501c3 capacity. We've got examples of people that have created both and solved problems. And so I never want to put someone right into a track that might not be the right one for them. I can think of lots of problems that shouldn't be solved by nonprofit and lots that probably should. So it's an agnostic approach there. And I think we can all push towards that dismantling, which will only help the nonprofit space specifically more as we grow.
Did you come up against that when you were starting the organization? Like that people were like, Nick, why are you starting a nonprofit? There's like tons of nonprofits. Why don't you do something else?
Yeah, that's a popular question. And then another popular question, as I'm sure everyone on the call can relate to, is, oh, that's nice, but what are you going to do for a real job, right? Get that all the time, because people think nonprofit, it must not make any money, right? It's not how it works. So yeah, there's some misconceptions there that you need to knock down, and whether it is addressing how it's a real job or why you're starting a nonprofit. The more you're educated and the more you know, the more you can share. And I always use the lemonade stand example, Mitch, to anyone that asks about it. And I just say, if Mitch and I started a lemonade stand today and we both would buy the materials, Mitch buys the lemons, I buy the sugar and the cups, we meet on the corner and we make $100. For-profit company, we can do whatever we want with our profit that day. It costs us $20 to buy the materials. We got $80. Mitch can take 40. I can take 40. We can reinvest it all. We just aren't chained to what we do with the margin. Same example, Mitch and I have a lemonade stand. It's making me thirsty talking about lemonade. It's a nonprofit. We make $100 margin. We have to reinvest that back into the business, right? And the next day we can set a new budget and we can make that budget and hit it. And then any profit, we got to reinvest it back to the business. So that's kind of my go-to analogy, and analogies themselves are always inherently flawed, but that's the best I got when I'm trying to explain the difference.
Yeah. And what's the other layer on that analogy is, like your first one, you can do whatever you want with it. And in your second example, it's not only you have to reinvest it, but there's like all this quagmire of restrictions and things you have to think about and how you spend that money and quote unquote oversight and quote unquote accountability. How did you start to learn about the overhead restrictions as you were getting, because I'm sure you weren't like steeped in that as when you were just
Right.
like trying to solve this problem with kids alone in hospitals. Do you remember your first encounter with these overhead limitations?
Yeah, for sure. I remember it vividly. And one other point before I jump into that is I often say to people in the lemonade stand example, if they continue to ask questions, on the for-profit side, Mitch and I wouldn't have to really share with anyone what materials we bought and how we spent the profit. On the nonprofit side, they'd ask how many sheets of toilet paper we used that day, down to the sheet, right? Like it's that detailed, right? But I can remember the first time we ran into this discussion was when we were applying for a grant. And as a grassroots nonprofit, kind of the typical journey is you get that friends and family round, just kind of like a startup, right? Friends and family round of donations and build some momentum off that. And maybe you get the $1,000, $2,000, $5,000 grants from like some local companies, people you know. And then eventually you start to apply for the 10K, 25K, 50K beyond types of grants. And that's when I first started to be exposed to those questions of what's your overhead percentage? How much do you spend on administrative costs? And that was, you sink or swim in that moment of I need to figure out what they mean by these words, because I was just kind of starting this thing and raising some money and trying to comfort kids. And you jump into the education side.
Yeah, I mean, you had a real like trial by fire to learn about this and figure it all out. What did you start figuring out? Like, how did that change or not change how you were operating the organization?
Yeah, you start to figure out that, hey, there's there's large sources of funding that place a lot of emphasis on overhead, that place a lot of emphasis on detailed budgets, that place a lot of emphasis on administrative costs and fundraising costs versus program costs. And those are the first key terms that you start to learn: program versus administrative, right? Or fundraising. And then you start to learn, well, as a staff member, is 100% of my salary programmatic, or is it 100% of it fundraising? And it's never that, right? Like most nonprofits, you wear 7 hats. You just then have to start to think, well, what are my 7 hats and how many of those fit into the program? If you want to start to play the game of, well, I need to fit into a certain number level of administrative cost or percentage. And so you educate, and then kind of like when you first start doing your own taxes and your accountant says, oh yeah, well, do you run a side hustle? And did you buy yourself shoes for your fitness business? Like we can write that. Like you just start to learn the nuances there to play the game.
And what did you find was lost in having to do that? And like, what kind of practical impact did that have on your output as an organization?
Yeah, you start to see, like when we achieved a certain level of scale at Fleece and Thank You, I can remember it specifically. I applied for a grant, and like the greatest need of those funds was for sure to invest in a team member, like 100%, no question. And I remember looking at the implications of what that would have done to that overhead percentage relative to the funder, and it just totally missing. Like it was not going to work. And it was so disappointing to know that this staff position would allow me to do X thousand more blankets right through this position, but I'm not able to do it from this great funding source because of how it's going to upset the administrative cost percentage.
Yeah, I mean, I had a similar experience. Just I received like a local startup grant, and it was only $500. It wasn't anything major, but they asked me what I was going to spend it on. And I said, like, well, I've got one teammate at the time developing our product. Like, that's what I need to invest it in. That's the only cost we have. And they were like, oh, yeah, we don't fund headcount. So, like, you need to come up with something else. And I was like, okay, we'll make a Facebook ad. And they were like, okay, perfect. And I was like, so you would rather incentivize me to spend on this money not in a person and to this big company, and also something not really like a long-term investment in the business. And so it's like this intention getting completely in the way of the outcome that they're trying to achieve.
Mm-hmm.
Did you, like, what happened when you pushed back? Did you get any interesting insight when you kind of questioned these priorities of funders?
Yeah, I'm always pushing back, right? Like status quo, I'm always trying to test it for better or for worse. I remember pushing back on this one and being met with deaf ears. And so you have to look at the institutions that you're looking to fundraise from, and, always push back when you can, be a voice and be loud about things. but just, know when you're wasting your time or not. This particular institution had been around for a long time. I could see there wasn't going to be a change in their ways unless they had some personnel changes and shook it up that way, which is out of my control. So that one I ended up having to just let go. And you got to know sometimes when to do that, right?
Yeah. And Ingrid just dropped in the comments, make sure we get for the recording, who do they think will be running the programs? I mean, such a great point is like these false dichotomies within these like even as a small organization, there's a lot of complexity in people's roles. I mean, think of me as a startup or you as a startup nonprofit, like all the hats people are wearing. And there's a reason Pond made hats that say one of my many hats on the hat. It's just like ever present and true.
Yeah. And I'll give the specific example that we're talking about here, Ingrid, to your point. It's like this position, we at Fleece and Thank You, we do hundreds of events with groups, all types of groups, right? And corporations and schools and churches. And we saw at the time, like schools were really clicking for us. Lots of schools wanting to do blanket events. So I wanted to bring a staff person on to solely focus on running blanket making events with schools. Now, yes, they would be running the actual blanket making event, but they're also doing the outreach side to hundreds of thousands of schools. And that piece in the funder side was the administrative fundraising percentage that threw off the whole percentage. So it's a great question, Ingrid. It's like, it was very, very frustrating.
And it's also, it points out like that blanket restriction and ratio, and you're at a totally different stage organization where, yeah, of course, one new hire is going to have like this huge impact on your overall ratio. And how inappropriate a binary is like across lots of organizations. I guess like what I'm curious about, if you have a view on, is what we're talking about today is not new. I don't want anyone in the audience to think that like you and I think we're uncovering something for the first time. Like people have been pounding the table about this for over a decade. I think especially the Dan Pallotta TED Talk really moved the conversation forward, pointing out some of the damaging impacts. But it still shows up. Like it's still really common, and it's more common than people want to think. Like, why do you think that the needle hasn't moved more in the last decade?
We need to change the conversation on the destination, and we need to change the metrics on the destination, right? The destination today often is ending at administrative costs, and we're not actually finding the right processes to put in place to make impact the metric and how you get to impact and the results of that impact, right? And so yes, we're not uncovering anything new here. We also need everyone listening to this. We need to know what we're signing up for. Like this is a long haul, but like some of the greatest feats of humankind were not finished by the people that started those movements, right? We need to be constantly preaching that impact needs to be the destination. If you want to fund me, I need to be able to tell you what impact I can make with those dollars and then prove that I can do that and come back to you and show I made that impact and then fund me based off of that. Because too often it's, yeah, I can comfort X kids. Well, we'll give you this money, but how much is going to go to administrative? Okay, well, that's going to make me comfort less kids. But as long as it doesn't hit over 10% overhead, we'll still fund you. And there's so many flaws to that conversation.
And you mentioned something earlier about kind of just acknowledging I'm probably not going to change this person's mindset. And clearly there are a lot of funders and donors that do have that mindset. For everyone here, and I know we want this conversation to be about actionable things we can do. How do you make that call of like, when is it worth trying to change hearts and minds? And when do you have that like self-preservation to be like, you know what, I don't need to expend my energy on this. And I think that's hard, especially I know you and you're so like caring and you want people to like do the right thing and you want to believe in people. And sometimes you kind of have to acknowledge that you can't. How do you make that decision?
Yeah, I push the buck to them from the standpoint of the funders that started with the overhead obstacle that I was able to break through. The conversation moved to, hey, are you willing to experiment a little bit here with me? I understand that this is how you've done some things. Here's what I'm proposing. I'll, graciously accept this grant from you. My overhead is going to go to X, which is Y above what you're saying it needs to be. But by doing that, I can help 10X the number of kids in the end. Give me 12 months to do that and prove myself to you. And again, see how that's received. And even some I've gone as far as to say, and if I don't, I'll pay you back. Like let's figure out how we structure this as a loan. We'll take on some debt. Like, I'm willing to do that because I'm so confident that I can make this impact happen. And the right organizations and people and on the inside, they'll champion it. They'll say, this is great. I haven't thought about it this way. I've always wanted to try something like this, but no one's come with a fleshed out idea. And then, of course, there's ones that the reaction to that question tells you everything, because that someone who doesn't want to do it's just going to be, they're probably going to laugh you off the call.
Yeah, we did a session yesterday with 3 super experienced fundraisers in the nonprofit space called a practical pep talk. It was a lot of conversation like this, is, how to keep going and those moments when you feel like you're banging your head against the wall. And there was a lot of similar advice that was like, you always have to ask at least one question. Never let it like completely die on the vine. If you get that first no, because it's so often a not now, not a no. And so I would just reiterate that asking the one question and using the feedback there to listen to people and be like, this is worth pushing further, or like, that's a dead end and I don't need to keep going down it. So thank you for giving that specific example.
Yeah, always ask. Like you said, persistence goes a long way with some people. And for whatever, like, no's come for so many reasons, but persistence can kind of bust through sometimes half to 75% of those reasons, put you back in the game.
Well, and like you brought up a good point of the long haul here. Like the reason Dan gave that TED talk and it's all of a sudden every funder wasn't like, oh my God, you're so right. Like, let's completely change how we do. Like, this is systemic. It's really ingrained and it's going to take a while. So I think having that mindset that you can like be moving the needle with individual people, with individual organizations, and that is going to keep building the crescendo. Have you found, as you have those tough conversations with funders, have you seen them kind of engaging with their peers around like the different approach you took, or changing some of that mindset, at least within their community too?
Yeah, the right people take that type of conversation and spreading it right to peered funders, et cetera. The right people, like you said, if it's just me asking it, like maybe they'll take it back. But if I ask and Ingrid asks and Jacob asks and Ben and Amanda, and they're going to eventually have to be like, holy smokes, this is like the 6th time in a month that someone's asked me this question. Hey, other funder, are you getting asked this question? And then the conversation takes it from there. And that's how movements are born.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking about this morning before this conversation of, at Pond, a lot of what we do is about power, because there's so much like power imbalance in the nonprofit sector, just structurally, your board, your donors, your funders. And there is this, I feel like, the fragmentation in the sector and like localization, right? Because so many funders are localized, and then you get like local pockets and communities. It's hard to recognize that there are 12 million of you doing this. And there's so much strength and power in those numbers, not to mention the assets you have, right? Your skills, your experience, your passion, like connection to solving these problems. And that's like an incredibly valuable thing that this cohort of people brings to the table. And I love that like encouragement to say, like, we have strength in numbers. If everybody is asking those questions, people have to listen. And that definitely is going to play a big part.
For sure. And it's multiple ways. And to your point of actionable takeaways, we've talked about how the conversation with the funder should go and some things that we can do and ask the next question and what it could sound like. Then on our side, there's a lot in our control too. Like, throw the impact metrics front and center on your site always. Lead with the impact metrics and the data as you tell stories, and make sure all your storytelling has data in it. Those types of things, we can, again, start to change the conversation from this side, hit the funders from this side, and the groundswell will create some momentum that we've been needing.
Yeah, I love that prompt of like, think about, are you playing into that same existing stereotype or existing limitations? Like, are you putting your overhead percentage front and center because it looks good, versus longer term outcomes and that data, or how you frame your impact and what investment it takes to get there? I just think that's really smart. How did you develop that process of how you presented your impact? Because you brought this up of like moving away from a focus on inputs, because that's what expenses are, right? That's an input. And that is really not aligned to the objectives of nonprofits that are solving problems and they are outcome focused. But it's a
Yep.
lot easier to standardize, to measure in a standard way and to standardize. So how did you think about framing impact, and how have you seen that across your peers of how they effectively frame impact?
Yeah, I think there's two main ways to get there, Mitch. The first is it's like the simplest, most simplified version of it. If you just ask yourself, what's the mission of my nonprofit? Like, what is the tangible numerical impact? Take the number of dollars you raised last year and then divide it by your impact and get for every $30 chunk, I can comfort one kid in the hospital. You've got a story there as you talk, right? And then when someone gives you a $30 or a $3,000, you can start to then say back, thank you. And through video, through other things, you can say, I helped one child, I comforted 100 kids, those types of things would be way one. And then two, the fundraising appeal and campaign side. I'm so far to the one side of the spectrum that every campaign should be just so hyper impact focused. And I totally am sensitive to the fact that like general operating budget and expenses is a very real thing, and you need dollars that are not restricted. So there's ways to get those as well. But like mid-year fundraising and end of year fundraising are great opportunities. Like right now we're kicking off our mid-year fundraiser at Fleece and Thank You. They're great opportunities to say, here's exactly what we need. This is exactly what we're fundraising for. And I'll show you that back in video, right into your text messages type of thing. For us, it's like shelving in our warehouse, just trying to raise a certain amount of money to get a certain amount of shelves. If we hit the goal, we'll buy the shelves. I'll show you exactly what we did with it. And then I'll tell you how the shelves then help us comfort more kids in the end. So there's two ways. It's like, get your big number, your high level number. For every dollar we get, we can comfort X, make X impact. And then make your fundraising campaigns as specific as you can, because that's just real, man. I think just people just want realness today. They just don't be transparent and real about it. It's what people are asking for.
Yeah, and I love that example too, because you are being specific about where the funds are going, but not shying away from the fact that like maybe shelving in a warehouse isn't the sexiest thing, but like let's be front and center that, yeah, maybe that's quote unquote overhead. And that's like infrastructure spending and less direct of like that kid receiving the blanket, but it's such a critical part. And so you're putting that front and center and not shying away from that. And I've seen a lot of times people are afraid to, or the example of like the staff member, right? We really need another person. And traditionally that might fall into the overhead bucket. But let's reframe that for ourselves. And that's something that organizations and leaders really have in their control, which I love.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of that you can trace it back to data, which is an unsexy word, right? Like it is so much more sexier to show the blanket recipient in the hospital, but to use data in your stories, like together, everyone watches this. We need to all together work together to incorporate data in our storytelling, because that will just sophisticate. I don't know if sophisticate's a word. It will sophisticate the industry, right? To the for-profit world, the nonprofit industry looked at as, for the most part, right? You had an experience, there was an emotional reaction, and you started a business, but didn't really know what you were doing. And it's all powered by emotion. It's not the case. It's so often not the case. And we can do better in our storytelling using data to change that narrative as well.
And I mean, with data, there's also just like simple math to get people off of this like overhead myth nonsense, like, which I know you're a big proponent of. Do you mind giving that example that you share about just like stares people in the face to say like this math doesn't add up by you having this restriction?
Yeah, which is a hot topic and helps a lot. A new analogy I've been using in some of these conversations, Mitch, is if I offered you a car and I told you that this car has a 400 mile, life tank in it. I've told you something about the car, but I haven't really given you like something that impactful. If I told you that this car costs $100 to fill up, like I still haven't told you anything. If I told you the miles per gallon on a car, you're like, okay, this has a real impact to me. Like I know what I'm going to get miles per gallon. Like to me, overhead numbers are more talking about how big is that car's tank, or how much does it cost to fill that car up, and knowing no other details about it. miles per gallon is like what truly matters, because you and I have to pull up to the pump today and put gas in our car. Or if you're in New York, maybe the car analogy doesn't fit, but you get what I'm saying. Like the miles per gallon is related to the impact here. Like, let's talk about if charity A brings in $1 million, spends $100,000 on overhead and serves 100 kids, people are cheering 10%, right? People are loving it. Charity B brings in $1 million, spends $500,000 on overhead, but serves 1,000 kids. Okay, let's take a step back here. Like Charity A has a 10% overhead. Charity B has a 50% overhead. And if we stop the conversation there, we're literally just talking about how big is the gas tank on that car and on that one, we know nothing else, right? And it's just where the conversation, that can't be the destination. We need to talk about how Charity B helps 10 times the number of kids and does it at only 5 times the capacity increase. And then when you say, cool, if we throw dollars on that, we scale that up, more impact. And it's the same way when we're fundraising on the for-profit side, we have to sell that, right? Like, here's the model, this is what's working, pour dollars on this, and we scale it up. Let's start to bring those conversations over, because it's some of the same logic.
Yeah, I mean, it seems so obvious to me. And I think it seems obvious to you, and the numbers just make a ton of sense. I guess what's holding us back and holding a lot of people back is that's, again, hard to standardize. And everyone's looking for like black and white binary ways to standardize and evaluate. And it's just more complex than that. And one thing that goes along with that is room for experimentation and failure.
Mm-hmm.
So like everything we've been talking about so far is kind of under this assumption that everything's going great. and like, yes, we spent this money and had this return in terms of impact. Awesome. But the reality is, as you mentioned at the beginning, we're solving like huge problems long-term. And there's going to be, you need to experiment, and you're going to have to fail. And this funding structure also doesn't allow for that failure. And I would argue that just focusing on impact alone also doesn't allow for that failure. Like, how do you think about the room for failure with funding, in funder conversations and experimentation as a nonprofit?
What an awesome question. When it comes to the room for failure, I think that in that, what we gave was a simplified version of the conversation to a funder. To give the room for failure, you need to say, I'm either going to achieve this impact, or I'm going to learn these 5 things. And if I don't achieve this impact, I'm going to learn these 5, and I'll take these ones and try again, because these assumptions will change. And now I think hypothesis B will be the next step. And if you can get a funder that's like bought into then the greater vision, like you said, it's not just short-sighted. It's, I'm going to try this. I think I can make this impact. If I don't, it's probably because assumption 2, 4, and 5 were wrong. We'll change those and we'll try again to then achieve that level of impact. So it's about identifying what the learnings will be when you're setting out on the frontier of a campaign. Oh, I think you're muted.
Sorry, I should stay off here. I just don't want that sirens in the background to be distracting everyone. 2 things that you brought up that I wanted to lift up there are like that planning and relationship. So you've actually set out a plan. So what the outcome, there is no way for it to be a failure. It might not go down path A, it might go down path B, but you have prepared enough to think about, what did I do to parse out what might have worked, what we could try again. And I think that planning and preparation prevents you from having real failure. And I think that's really important. And the second piece is what the example you gave is, you have enough of a relationship with that funder to set that out at the beginning and then follow up afterwards. So then like that failure might actually be the reason for more funding, because you've followed through on what you said you're going to do. You've learned and honed in on the right next step. And been really systematic about it. So I love that it's so tangible and actionable for people, and actually accrues relationship capital with those funders.
Mm-hmm. And you've lived this. Like these conversations happen in the startup for-profit world every day. Of, I'm taking on X funding because I'm going to do X customer acquisition. Oh, rarely do we hit that number. We're going to take on more funding, but what did we learn from it? And like, it's all part of that ongoing story. Again, just changing the conversation is where some of this starts, being persistent and changing the conversation.
And I think, I'm sure there are a couple people in the funding landscape on this call too, or that are connected there. Let's shift a little bit to like, what do the best funders you've worked with, like how do they positively contribute to this conversation? And maybe some like red flags that you would recommend people avoid.
The best funders that we have worked with so far, the dream funder is someone who doesn't just give capital, but gives resources and expertise as well, obviously. So if you can find that, hang on to that and cultivate and be responsive to their needs and keep them on board. So that'd be like criteria one. If someone says, we'll give you X in funding, we're on board with the impact we think you can make with this. We're dialed into what you'll learn from this campaign. And by the way, we have an in-house person who's a resident expert in this. We'd love to give them, 10, 20 hours a week of time to you to help there. And we're connected to this organization that we think can be a partner in your campaign. So like resources plus the capital is a dream scenario when it comes to finding a funder. And if you ask those questions and they're just so against it, or they want to give you funding in tranches, like that's when you can kind of start to say, I think like the tranches one is sometimes can be a red flag. If the tranche you're giving me isn't even enough to make the impact from the campaign, like, oh, you need 50,000. Well, we'll give you 10 if you can go find other people that give you 10. Like, okay, thank you. Yes, I'll graciously take it. But if you're really committed to the impact, like I know you've got the capital because you manage 2.5 billion in assets and it's publicly available information. Like, let's just do this. Why aren't we doing this?
Yeah, and I think what you brought up there too, and it's reminding me from your comments earlier, where there's also a lot of privilege that I think we should acknowledge in having access to those conversations or feeling like empowered to push back or suggest something different to a funder. This came up a lot in the conversation we were having yesterday for a lot of people of color, women, folks from different socioeconomic backgrounds. It's a much higher hurdle for them to feel comfortable having those conversations. How can funders, in your experience, invite that dialogue in? Like, how can they be more inclusive in who actually gets to have those productive conversations moving beyond the black and white of their grant application?
This is a golden question, Mitch. If I had the right answers to this one, it'd be powerful. I don't know if I do, truthfully. I think my best attempt at it is if funders can be more transparent about all the types of applications that they're getting in and all the types of and variety of funding that they're looking at, it might instill more confidence for across the board for people that are applying to say, like, this is the pool I'm in, this is the pond that I'm competing with or competing next to, as part of a greater narrative. So I think maybe that might be one of the things, if we can open up some transparency on what is the funding pool applicant, what does that look like? And then that could give some more people maybe some extra confidence, like you said, to have some of those conversations.
Yeah, and I think it's also setting that as an expectation that follow-up conversations are okay. Because some people who are just like, well, I'm going to go ask, like, what, kind of have a bit more of an assertive attitude and unafraid to question the way things are. But I think if you're transparent that you're open to conversations, right? If you have questions, reach out. Or like I've just heard from so many folks at nonprofits, especially the earlier stage or more grassroots ones, where they're trying to establish those relationships for the first time. Maybe they don't have a lot of friends and family that can make $1,000 gifts, and they're really scrappy. And how they're like, well, I just didn't hear anything back for months, and then I got like a template email that gave me no direction or access. And so I think making it clear you're open to follow-up conversations, willing to be helpful. If you can't fund them, knowing funders are the best source of knowledge on the funding landscape. They generally know where they sit versus their peers, and often are able to make a suggestion on, oh, you're a little too early stage for us, but check out this foundation.
Right.
And so I just think that will go a really long way from the funder side of developing those relationships. Transparency and access and making that clear, because otherwise it'll only go to the people who already have the privilege to, have those kind of like outside the norm structures that aren't totally transparent to their audience.
Yeah, you've given another red flag. You asked about red flags. If the response back is super stock, super canned, no direction at all, then you've learned some things about that funder. So this is a call to funders listening to this of like, hey, we have some responsibility on the nonprofit side. We're going to take it. We're going to get there. I think that funders do too, to be that directive, like you said. And if you really want us to make more impact, you've got some resources that you can share.
Yeah, and one thing that we talked about earlier on, nonprofit as a business, and I've heard this a lot of like nonprofits should operate more like businesses. I think there's a lot of value and validity to that comment. There's also some, I think, danger in it or like potential issue where it's like, yeah, but we're also not like worshiping corporate America as like the goal of how we run nonprofits. We think there's a lot to learn from engaging with community and things that nonprofits inherently do well. Like, how do you think about that line between the two of like, yes, run more like a business, but not lose what makes nonprofits so great?
Man, that's another golden question. It's another golden question. I think I'm going to appeal to the destination again, right? In a for-profit structure, the destination is maximizing profits for the shareholders. You can't stop there. If you're going to run your nonprofit like a for-profit, you have to remember the destination has to be the impact you're making and the dollars it's going to take to make that impact, so that you never lose focus of that. And you can do that in small ways. You can do that in big ways. At Fleece and Thank You, we put an extra chair in the room at meetings with no one in it. So that represents the kids that we're serving, so that we never get too focused on the way the model that we built and the revenue side and the cost of goods and some truly for-profit conversations that happen, so that it always ends at the destination of how does what we just talked about, everyone, help that seat right there.
Yeah, and we just got a comment that I want to lift up for folks. Thanks, Jeff, that he said the biggest force to overcome is energized by the financial and regulatory community. Nonprofit accounting rules, IRS 990, state and government, regulatory watchdogs all measure using easily identifiable and audited numbers and publish nonprofit efficiency using the traditional program ratio. Can't easily escape the gravitational pull on the donor community. I guess I have some thoughts here, but I'd love to get your reactions to that, Nicholas, too.
Yeah, and Jeff, 100%. If you got more to share here, I'd love to continue to dive in on this one if we do have the time. But yeah, this is what I'm talking about when it's a long play, right? Like everything Jeff's listed here, super valid. These are all things that individually we need to start to look at and say, is there a better way? This is not a 5-year, this is probably not even a 10-year change that would have to happen here. Because to your point, Jeff, the donor community is looking at things like this and using them as their measuring stick. And so we can change the donor community in some ways, but let's also work from both sides. And this is going to be a long haul here, but it's going to take an impact reporting infrastructure like we've never seen before, so that you can make impact easily identifiable and audited in some way. It's going to be a big lift, and we might not see it in our lifetime.
Yeah. And something I heard in a conversation several months ago, I think the woman's name was Kate Roth, who's an accounting professor. And she just brought up the fact that like the financial standards and how we measure profit, which we think of as so simple and obvious and black and white, that was also invented. Like the whole accounting system we operate under had to be established. And it's not a given. Like that had to be created. There were all different kinds of measures for this before it was standardized. And so I thought that was really powerful to open our eyes to like, oh, there is opportunity to standardize how we think about impact in a way that is a lot more productive than these program ratios, like you mentioned, Jeff. So I think that's something that's super interesting. And then the other piece I just think in the donor community is like the more donors that we have talking to each other about different ways to look at philanthropy is really important. It's really hard to do. It's not like a targeted community you can go after, like the general public, but making sure that there is an understanding And I think conversations like this and nonprofit leaders being well equipped to debunk these myths are really important too. So like whenever those come up in a conversation, first of all, that is a gift. Whenever someone gives you feedback, even if you disagree with it, it is such a gift. And that is your opportunity to shift that heart and mind right in front of you. And that might have this butterfly effect of now they're better educated about where they might have been wrong, and they're going to be able to correct some other people. And from there, and I've seen a lot of that in my personal life, where people want to ask these questions, and it's just funny. It's still so persistent. You will hear from so many donors, board members that continue to persist these like, oh, well, but let's circle back on their administrative costs or their overhead ratio as like a primary discussion point. But I don't know, have you been able to see that amongst your own donor base and community, Nicholas?
Yeah, we're in a time where I think there's an up and coming, if it's not already here, group of, and I know people throw out the term millennials and Gen Zs and all those, but there's a current volunteer base out there or potential donor base that wants to give time before they give dollars. And that's really powerful for this conversation, right? Because they'll see impact before they financially donate to the impact. And that's possibly 180-degree shift to maybe where 20 years ago someone looked at philanthropy. So on that side, I think we're moving in a really good direction. And then to Jeff's comment on the financial side, like we have a whole industry, CPAs, that do financial audits. What's it going to take to get to an impact audit, and who's going to be the one to do it? Hey, like we're going to need 100 more webinars to figure that one out, but let's figure it out. That's exciting to me to get to a place in a future state where that could be the case, that you have an impact audit by an accredited someone. It's dialed in, super fair. And the charities that are making the most impact are being rewarded for that, regardless of all other factors.
Yeah, I think there's that bigger question of impact measurement and standardizing it and making that an evaluation metric. I also think there's not shying away from funding the most, like believing a nonprofit leader that they know the right use of funds because they're seeing this every day. And I think that gets into trust philanthropy, which we have a whole nother conversation on in 2 weeks. But I think of this a lot in the Pond context, where people are coming to us saying, I need a new piece of software, I need a new consultant to do XYZ. And it's like, we're surfacing that project for them, connecting them with the right vendors. And our goal is to be able to say, I would love funders to come in and be like, oh, you've stated your problem. You've gone through a really methodical process of how to solve it. You're connecting with vendors that are vetted in this peer community. Great. Like that's the type of thing I should be funding. Like I should be trying to fund those shelves. I should be trying to fund that new software system because you know what the impact is. And I now maybe it's hard to, I'm struggling to trust every individual just because they run a nonprofit, but can I trust that platform, that intermediary that's connecting them with the right people and the right products that they're spending money on? I mean, that's my hope for how Pond could contribute to some of that systemic change of like encouraging people to identify funding needs in a specific way. And maybe that is a way that funders get interested, as opposed to if the general operating, like here, take this money, do what you want with it, is a bridge too far right now.
Building the communities like the one you're building at Pond are going to have so many implications, right? There's so many amazingly positive implications of the types of communities like you're building, Mitch.
Yeah, and something I just want to make sure we get that Robin commented to us, that charity rating orgs methods of comparison can actually hurt some amazing organizations. Example is how foundations funding cycles for grant making can ding an organization and it's seen as a liability. I think there's two things in there that really stood out to me, Robin. One is the point that you raised, comparison, and the fact that you all of a sudden now are pitting organizations against each other to say like, this is better than this one because of this metric. I'm sure you've seen this a lot, Nicholas, but oh my gosh, we're so much stronger together with related organizations seeking funding and galvanizing those conversations. It's a bigger pie conversation. Like, how have you seen this play out, Nick?
Yeah, we don't do it enough, but applying for group grants, like you could probably create a whole industry out of a group grant type of approach of pooling nonprofits who don't even know each other and don't even know that you can apply jointly for some of these sources of funding. And nonprofit A applies for 10 and gets one, and B applies for 10 and gets none. But A, B, C, and D come together and we get 5 of the 10 now. And like, that was a tangent, but I think that group grant thought process is something that I don't even leverage enough. And I'm like, so for it. We could all start to think differently that way.
Yeah, and I think I've seen this come up a lot, by the way, and you may see this too in different parts of Michigan, but folks talk to in like South Dakota and like all these different areas. The dial gets turned up on this in smaller communities, where maybe there's fewer sources of wealth and grant making and fewer organizations. And so there is all of a sudden this like competitive tension. And the fact that these ratios or this mindset further fuels that is such a bad, like, I'm sure unintended, but a bad consequence that creates competitive tension so unnecessarily. It also goes back to scarcity mindset, which I think this conversation fuels when you talk about overhead restrictions, is that like, oh, there's only so much money to go around. So we just got to be concerned with ourselves, and maybe even myself, not an additional staff member, like containing expenses is very scarcity mindset aligned. And I just think like we've got these other systems we're discussing, and these other mindsets are contributing to abundance mindset in a big way. How do you encourage your own team, Nicholas, on not falling into that scarcity mindset trap because you're at a nonprofit?
Yeah, there's something to be said about scarcity mindset in certain times of, can you do more with less? Great. Always like be lean, always be asking that question. But when you get to a point where you can't do with the less that you've just created, like that's when you need to realize, right? That's when you need to realize. And so at Fleece and Thank You, we have a philosophy of like, we will experiment something once almost every time. We will experiment it once and we will do a great job of documenting that experimentation. Here's what we invested into this opportunity in this experiment, and here's what we got out, and here's our learnings. Give us that room for failure. And we're going to now assess right after and say, from the learnings, do we want to experiment a second time, or do we want to put this out behind the warehouse and not touch it again? So encourage experimentation among your teams and have a really good process for documenting and learning.
Yeah, I love that. And again, I'll keep reiterating, like, these are things in our control, right? That you can set that culture and mindset on your team. And it doesn't always have to be expensive, right? That is a cultural way your team engages and is really, really important to be intentional with. And I just Robin threw another comment in, just clarifying that, which I didn't catch this the first time. Her point was the rating orgs make the comparison and ding a grant making foundation for its cycle of funding. So the point here is like, it's not only hurting the nonprofits, it's also hurting the funders in many instances, these ratios, because they're evaluated in a similar fashion, especially if they're doing their own fundraising and then granting, where they are looked at under a similar microscope. So, I mean, like with so many of these like societal power dynamics, they're harming everyone. They're serving no one.
Yeah, a future talk would be great. You know, I'd count me as the first viewer, as if you brought on a community foundation, if you haven't already, and talked about that assets under management type of stigma that can come. And it's like, we're going to be judged on how big our assets under management is, not the dollars we dole out and the impact that those create. It's similar to the overhead type of journey that we'll have to go on here.
Yeah, or the restrictions on how much funds need to be paid out, either at a DAF or a foundation. And it's just, there's a lot of work to be done on the legal, because now we're getting into, those are legal tax code requirements versus overhead limitations and ratios are guidance, but super, super powerful. But along that spectrum, I think there's a lot of work to be, when were these set? When was this determined? Decades ago. So much has changed. Like, can we galvanize some new conversation and some real change here? And I think just recognizing just giving yourself the space to step back and be like, well, why is this the way it is? And like, could it be better? Could it be different? I think a lot of people fall into the trap of, well, it's worked fine first in so many instances when you're like, okay, that doesn't mean it couldn't be better. There's always room to be re-examining. And this is very much, which I think goes to your talk too, like that entrepreneurial mindset that we can all take. It doesn't mean everyone has to start a tech startup. You can have that mindset of re-examining, like any time where you ask a question where something doesn't quite make sense and the first answer is like, well, it's always been that way. Like red flag, ask that question louder, start having conversations.
Sure. As we bring this home here, as we get to the top of the hour, like if I'm sitting watching this as a small to mid-sized nonprofit and I'm giving that lens, because that's, you know, where I sit today, what I'm hopefully taking from this is not just that we've identified lots of issues. Of course we have, and we've been able to opine on them and it's been great, but also within the conversation, it's been, you know, what can we do? And it's, you know, push to have the conversation with funders when it shifts to overhead and only overhead as the destination. So can we change the destination in conversations with funders and have the confidence to do that? And then 2, can we, on the donor side, make sure we're having the right conversations there and doing our best job to walk the walk and show impact as direct as we can? And then 3, run the experiment and be open to running the experiment and document it and learn from it, and run it again if your assumptions have changed and you think you can make more impact off it. And as a grassroots, small and mid-sized nonprofit, I hope you can take at least those 3 things away from this conversation, because those are 3 things that are within our power, is to push for better conversations about the destination, to run more experiments, and to be as good as we can be to fill that duty to show impact to our donors.
Yeah, that reframing is so good. And as you can all, Nick is just, he's a trained speaker. He knows to bring it home, give you the key takeaways. And this is really powerful. Thank you for all of your insight. Thanks for all the comments and engagement from the attendees here. We've really appreciated it. As Nick mentioned, and I mentioned, we've got this series all month long. So go to our webinar page and check out those future sessions. And anything you're looking to find and fund that often falls into the overhead bucket, be sure to use Pond for those searches. And if you have any questions, reach out. We're here to help. So thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.